Morning, everybody. Thanks for the kind invitation to come and talk to you. I can't tell you how unpopular I've become because of this sequin. People have personally removed me off their Christmas card lists. A bit of background first of all. We've heard a little bit about antimicrobial resistance so far. What we need to know is antimicrobial resistance is a worldwide problem. The WHO report that came out in 2014 showed that resistance in third-generation cephalosporins, things like ceftazidime and fluoroquinolones, things like ciprofloxacin in E. coli, was present over 50% in 5 out of the 6 WHO sort of countries. If you look what's happening with Klebsiella resistance going on, all 6 of the regions actually have resistance to third-generation cephalosporins, which is really worrying. And even more worrying for us is that 2 out of the 5 of the regions actually ended up having high-level resistance to carbapenems, our last-line antibiotics. So that's a real worry, and we've partly sort of heard that already. What we have to understand is that actually all antibiotics will actually become resistant in time. That's almost a given for us. And once we've got resistance, it's probably irreversible. And I'm sure we could debate that for weeks on end, but generally it's probably irreversible. And the other thing we know is antimicrobial resistance is probably directly linked to antimicrobial usage. And this is why we talk a bit more about the CQUIN. The other thing is the pipeline of new antibiotics that are coming through really is probably dripping at best. You may have seen on the news the other day that AstraZeneca is now withdrawn out of antimicrobial production and handed their whole portfolio over to Pfizer. So that's really sort of worrying sort of times at that. And even though we are talking about new models of funding, it seems to be a little way off from actually sort of getting there. Okay, so picture. This is my great-grandfather on the left. He's the junior person in the relationship there, and he lived in northern India in the British Army at the turn of the previous century. And he lived in a time when there were no antibiotics. The senior person on the right-hand side holding my grandfather is Major Howard. She was a nurse in the British Army. And so she was probably very closely connected to looking after patients with infections without antibiotics. And the reason I put this picture up is actually we know that antibiotics have probably saved more lives than probably any drug around. And it's estimated between 80 and 200 million lives and probably adds on average about 20 years to each life. Now, the reason I've shown you this picture of them in northern India is northern India's a place at the moment that's got fairly severe antibiotic resistance, and they're almost getting towards a time with certain infections where they have no antibiotics left for treating patients. And so they're almost going back to a time before sort of antibiotics. So some of you may have been, well, I imagine all of you have probably seen some of the work that Jim O'Neill's been doing about the antimicrobial resistance reviews. And what he's predicted, so Jim O'Neill's an economist, and he's actually predicted that antimicrobial resistance by the year 2050 will move from just being responsible for 750,000 deaths per year up to 10 million deaths per year because we don't have effective antibiotics, and that's more than cancer. And that equates to probably 1 person dying every 3 seconds because of an infection we can't treat. And that's pretty worrying, and that's why we're trying to do something now. Okay, so what's happening in the UK? Well, this is a bit of a scary sort of slide. I'll sort of talk you through. So top left, this is showing what's happening with bloodstream infections. So the 2 most common gram-negatives, so from gut organisms, E. coli and Klebsiella, they've increased over a 4-year period by 12% and 10% respectively. There is a bit of good news. Strep pneumoniae, because of the introduction of the new pneumococcal vaccine, has actually decreased by 1/4. And that's a really good news message. And one of the key things about infection prevention is about using vaccines appropriately. And that's one of the things I want you to take away as a message. Also, at the same time, we've seen an increase in resistance. If you just look at the arrows sort of on here, and we've seen big increases in resistance on here. And I'll mention pip/tazo in a while sort of on there. And we've seen huge increases in the use of antibiotics. Total antibiotics over a 4-year period have increased by 6%. Piperacillin tazobactam, our workhorse antibiotics, by over 56% per admission. So we're using huge amounts, and carbapenems by 36%. Now, I showed you already that usage is directly responsible for resistance. This just happens to be penicillin resistance in strep pneumoniae, but you can change any bug and antibiotics or drug combination, and you'll get a straight line of the more you use at a national level, the higher the resistance you've got. So who's prescribing all these antibiotics? Well, in general practice, who probably account for 3/4 of it, we actually put an incentive scheme in place last year, and we reduced antibiotic prescribing by over 7%. That's over 2.5 million prescriptions, and that's been seen around the world as a major step forward. In hospital, we probably account for almost 20% of the prescriptions, and I'll take you through that. So I'm sure most of you have heard of CQUINs. So CQUINs have been around for a while, and basically CQUINs are actually a framework to support improvement in the quality of hospital services and the creation of new improved patterns of care. Every year there's 4 or 5 of them. They're worth a lot of money, about 2.5% of the hospital's income. So we're talking millions generally sort of on here. This year, the clinical ones are sepsis, and it's in the second year, and we'll hear a little more about sepsis in a while, antimicrobial resistance, and then looking at physical health in patients with severe mental health, which is often overlooked. Now, one of the challenges we had in sepsis, and I don't want to steal Ron's thunder in any of this, is the really good news that came out of the sepsis CQUIN is actually patients with red flag sepsis were getting their antibiotics quicker, which is good, and probably turns into better survival, which is excellent news. The downside to it is that actually we're using about almost 10% more antibiotics, IV antibiotics, in the emergency department, so that's driving sort of usage up. And I'll talk about how we try and get this sort of balance in a moment. So this year we've got these 2 CQUINs, and I think they go hand in hand. So there's one which is around antimicrobial resistance, which is reducing inappropriate antibiotics, and I'll give you a bit more information on that and the sepsis CQUIN. So what's actually in the AMR CQUIN? Well, on here, it's asking for a 1% reduction in defined daily doses. So that means the average dose that you use of an antibiotic per admission. So this is accounts for activity against a baseline of 2013-14, which is part of the quality premium last year. We got all hospital supply data. And it covers total antibiotics, inpatients and outpatients, carbapenem, so meropenem, ertapenem, imipenem, piperacillin, tazobactam, and then trying to get a day 3 review sort of taking place, and that's empirical antibiotics. And we're expecting people who've done this by quarter 1, 25%, 50%, 75%, and 90% by the quarter 4. And the reason that's been brought in is actually we know hospitals aren't doing it. So despite all the nice guidance, only 10% could actually give us the data we needed. And this money is not your baseline budget. This is actually about investing in antimicrobial stewardship teams to improve IT, staffing, funding more expensive antibiotics or tests. It's not your baseline budget. It's about improvement, okay? So has it remained at 1%? No, the true targets are much higher because the antibiotic usage keeps on growing. And you can see on here, these are financial years, 13-14, 14-15, 15-16. Total antibiotics per occupied bed day, so not admissions, have gone up by 6%, carbapenems by almost 9%, piperacillin, tazobactam by almost 18%. So there's some fairly challenging things sort of out there for us to do. It probably overestimates the amount by about 2%. So hopefully shortly we'll have some real sort of data of where we are. So the whole thing about antimicrobial stewardship is about starting smart, so only using antibiotics where you actually need to use them, and we'll hear a bit more about that, but then focusing. So once we get some results back from the lab, we're able to review the sort of the patient, any imaging and things like that, narrowing down to the most narrow therapeutic sort of spectrum. So what do you need to do? So in order to achieve a CQUIN, you need to go away and say, actually, what's my biggest challenge? Is it total antibiotics? Is it carbapenems? Is it pip/tazo? Which guidelines do I recommend pip/tazo use or carbapenem use in? Are there any alternatives? And there's another session going on at lunchtime with my colleagues, Tim Collins, who will explore that in a bit more detail. So go to his session. Does my restricted or protected? So I'd like you to go away and stop calling certain antibiotics restricted because it means you can't play with the toys. Start using the word protected to try and get everyone to think about protecting and looking after these broad spectrum ones. How can I reduce my total consumption? Do we overtreat? Is it sepsis-driven? I know I've seen huge increases in my emergency department. Do we use more antibiotic compared to our peers? Well, I think we're actually slightly less in Leeds. Is our day 3 review outcome data good versus our peers? Actually, maybe not. 70% of our patients actually continue on IV antibiotics. So we've certainly got work to do there. Do we send appropriate samples for starting antibiotics? Yeah, in 4 out of 5 patients from my audit data, but that still leaves 1 out of 5. Come day 3, I've got no results to get back from the lab, so I'm missing an opportunity there. When I do get results back, do I act on them in a timely manner? Actually, no. 1 in 2 don't actually get looked at in time. So automatically, there's some sort of wastage there that I could do something about. And do we use diagnostic tests? No, we probably don't use them very well, and we could do better. So as ever, Scotland are ahead of the game. This is a graph looking at the top line is carbapenem use. The middle one is pip/tazo use. And you can see they've started to focus on it and actually started to turn the trend downwards. And I think we can do the same in England. And the reason is they've started using carbapenem-sparing agents, so things like some of the agents we've sort of listed up here, things like temacillin, astrianam, and some of the newer agents coming in. And they made a big increase only by having Dundee and Glasgow making any real big usage of them, and the rest probably still have work to do to catch up. If we look at, do we follow our restricted, our broad spectrum or protected antibiotics up? This is some work from the Chelsea and Westminster. Micro are probably unaware of 3/4 of the usage of it. And actually, if you spend 45 minutes a day by following them up, Chelsea and Westminster showed they stopped with half those antibiotics within 72 hours. So with a small investment in time, you can probably get good rewards. You can also think about setting up your prescriptions for antibiotics to try and drive switching. So this is a Leeds one, and you're meant to have a daily review code put on here. But what I'd say to you is, the people to try and drive this better are probably the nurses. Let's get the safety huddles on a ward round in the morning where we've got people on IV antibiotics to get reviewed. We know probably 1 in 3 patients are on antibiotic at any one time. How many of you are nurses in the audience? How much time does making up and giving IV antibiotics take? Loads and loads of time. Let's get rid of them if it's not needed. We also try and develop day 3 review tools. So this is something that's come from the literature we've sort of merged together, and we're hoping to sort of roll out sort of in Leeds to really get people to record the information they're using and using our IV to oral switch criteria by ticking sort of through and then coming up with a new plan. We did try putting a sticker in the notes, so the top version didn't really work very well. And actually, we're going to try and do the bottom sort of version to work a bit better. And the thing I'd say to you is, if you've got a patient on an IV antibiotic and they're eating, you should be thinking, why aren't they on oral, or why aren't they referring them to have home IV antibiotics, so an OPAT service. That's the message to get through. And then the last area I'm going to talk about is diagnostic markers. So there is, from a health technology assessment, some good work out there about the use of procalcitonin. It's been shown to reduce antibiotic duration by 3 days, hospital stay by almost 4, and ICU by almost 2 days sort of on there. And it's not sure if it was the procalcitonin or other things on here, and it could be cost saving. Now, NICE have said that it's not for routine sort of usage sort of in the UK, but those who are still using it need to feed their data in to monitor it. And there is a study going at the moment, if you want to feed your data in, called the CASPER study being run by Cordo Said from Winchester, who will collect this data to then feed through into NICE. I've got some of my CQUIN money to invest in procalcitonin, and I'm going to feed into this. So I'm going to start using it in ICU and acute admissions because I think it will offer some benefits. There is some new evidence for stewardship teams. You can decrease mortality by making sure that people follow guidelines, they de-escalate, and there's certainly bedside consultations for Staph aureus infections. IV to oral switches save money. Monitoring vancomycins, gentamicins reduces nephrotoxicity, and restricted antibiotic follow-up or protected might decrease use, but it will increase non-restricted use, but it does reduce some resistance. And then Evelina Taccolini at one of the European meetings has come up with some data showing that antimicrobial stewardship can reduce antimicrobial resistance, and the figures are up there. So the final bit is really leadership. So can we achieve this on our own? No. Let's join sepsis and antimicrobial stewardship together to work as one sort of big team on here. And what support do we need? We need senior leaders in the hospital to help us. I would say to you, go and talk to them if they're not talking to you already. I would be surprised when a sequin's worth often millions, they're not banging on your door all the time about making things happen. So in summary then, to meet the AMR and sepsis sequins, I think we end up having to force better systems for the review, de-escalation of empiric antibiotics. You need to go away and look at your guidelines and make sure they're audited and there's feedback. We need to have quality improvement, not annual audit. We need to think more about protected antibiotic systems that work. And we need and communication on a regular basis to keep sort of putting the message through here. And I think when we're doing education training, let's do it on the wards where people are actually doing the prescribing and not making them go to a classroom to do e-learning sort of on there. And finally, really, to meet all of this, we need strong and effective multidisciplinary leadership. We need champions at all levels. And I don't know if you can see my badge on here. The Antibiotic Guardian campaign is something I would encourage you all to sign up. And that should be our logo to drive improvement in antimicrobial stewardship. Otherwise, one person dying every 3 seconds might actually be closer than 2050. Thank you very much.